Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving deep into something that might seem pretty basic at first. Species.
Yeah, it seems simple enough on the surface, but it gets really interesting when you start to peel back the layers.
Exactly. And since you're listening to the Deep Dive, you probably already know that we like to get philosophical.
Oh,
So
we do.
we pulled out some fascinating stuff from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to really get into the nitty-gritty of species.
Mm.
What it is, how different thinkers have defined it, and even whether it exists at all.
It's going to be quite the journey.
It is. Okay, so to get us started, how about we rewind the clock a bit and talk about Aristotle? He was a big believer in essentialism, right?
Oh, absolutely. Aristotle was all about essences. The idea is that every category, and this includes species, has some kind of underlying essence that makes it what it is.
Sort of like a blueprint.
Exactly, a blueprint. So all lions, for example, would share this essential lionness that makes them lions regardless of any individual differences.
So even if a lion lost its mane or its roar, or even its taste for zebra, it would still be a lion deep down because of this invisible lionness.
Exactly. That was kind of the dominant view for centuries. But then along came Darwin and his theory of evolution, and suddenly this idea of fixed, unchanging essences became a lot harder to hold on to.
Yeah, because if species are constantly evolving and changing over time, how can you say there's one unchanging essence that defines them?
Right. It's like trying to nail down a moving target. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy really highlights how evolutionary processes like mutations, for example, complicate this idea of essentialism.
Mutations, those random genetic changes that can introduce totally new traits.
Exactly. So you might think you found a trait that's shared by every member of a species, something essential, and then boom, a single mutation in a future generation comes along and throws a wrench in the whole thing. Suddenly that essential trait isn't universal anymore.
So that pretty much throws the whole essence idea out the window, doesn't it?
It certainly makes it a lot harder to defend. And then you've got the whole issue of shared ancestry. A lot of the similarities between species are actually due to them having a common ancestor, not because they share some essential property.
Like how bats and whales are both mammals.
Exactly. They share certain features not because of some essential mammalness, but because way back when they both inherited those traits from a common ancestor.
It's kind of like inheriting your grandmother's nose or something like that. You share that feature because it's shared ancestry, not some predetermined essence. So if essentialism was taking a hit, how did philosophers and biologists try to redefine species after Darwin?
Well, one approach that really shook things up was this idea of species as individuals.
Species as individuals.
Yeah, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, but that's what philosophers Michael Disselin and David Hull proposed. They said instead of seeing species as categories defined by shared traits, we should see them as these unique historical entities, like individual organisms.
Wait, hold on. How can a group of organisms be like a single organism? That's kind of hard to wrap my head around.
Think of it this way. A single organism, like you or me, we have a lifespan, a beginning, and an end. And all of our parts are interconnected and working together. Giselin and Hull argued that species are similar, their lineages evolving through time, connected by these genealogical relationships.
So it's like a giant interconnected family tree. And each individual organism is kind of like a leaf on that tree.
A very good analogy. And just like you can't just randomly add some person to your family tree just because they happen to look like your cousin, an organism doesn't belong to a species just because it shares some traits. It's all about those genealogical connections.
Wow, that's like a huge shift in perspective.
It really is, and it has some pretty profound implications, especially for how we see ourselves as humans. Because if species are individuals, then there's no fixed humanness that defines us. Being human simply means belonging to that Homo sapiens lineage.
So even if, I don't know, even if I lost a limb or even my sense of humor, I'd still be human.
Biologically speaking, absolutely. It's all about that shared evolutionary history.
Okay, so we've gone from essentialism to species as individuals. Where do we go from here?
Well, remember how we said there's no single, universally agreed upon definition of species? That's still very much the case. And some philosophers think species are best understood as sets.
Sets. Like math class sets, Venn diagrams and all that.
Exactly, Venn diagrams and all that. It was philosopher Philip Kitcher who argued that we can think about species as sets of organisms. Instead of numbers, we have living things.
Okay, this is intriguing. How does this whole sets thing actually work with species?
Well, Kitcher argued that biology uses two main types of explanations, what he called proximate and ultimate explanations. Proximate causes explain the immediate mechanisms behind something.
Like the genes that code for eye color.
Exactly. That's a proximate explanation. You're explaining the how behind a trait. But ultimate causes are different. They delve into the evolutionary why. Why did that trait evolve in the first place? What were the selection pressures that favored it?
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how do these proximate and ultimate causes relate to species being sets?
Well, Kitcher suggested that proximate explanations often group organisms based on their structural similarities. Think about it. You've got all these organisms with similar structures. You can group them together, almost like a set. And that might be one way to define a species.
So like a species could be a set of all organisms with a specific gene sequence.
Precisely. But at the same time, Kitcher also recognized the importance of those ultimate explanations, the ones that focus on evolutionary lineages, which, remember, are more like individuals.
Right, so we've got species as sets based on structural similarities and species as individuals based on evolutionary lineages. Are those two sides of the same coin, maybe?
You could say that, and it really highlights how there are multiple facets to this whole species thing. But there's another approach we should touch on, and that's the homeostatic property cluster theory. This one offers yet another way to think about species, particularly as natural kinds.
Homeostatic property cluster theory. Whoa, that sounds a bit intimidating. What's that all about?
It's actually simpler than it sounds. The basic idea is that natural kinds, and that includes species, are groups that have shared clusters of properties. Now, these properties aren't necessarily essential in the Aristotelian sense, like that unchanging blueprint we talked about earlier. Instead, they're more about stability and interconnectedness.
So instead of one defining essence, we're looking for a bunch of traits that tend to stick together.
You got it. And these properties are maintained by what are called homeostatic mechanisms. These are essentially processes that help to ensure stability within a species.
Like a built-in system to keep things consistent.
Exactly. A good example of that is interbreeding. That helps to maintain a certain degree of genetic similarity within a species.
Right, makes sense. But are there any problems with this view?
Well, one challenge is that species are defined just as much by their variation as they are by their similarities. Look at dog breeds, for instance.
Right, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. It's pretty wild how much variation there is.
Exactly. And that inherent variation within species isn't something that the homeostatic property cluster theory fully accounts for.
So many different ways to think about species, each with its own set of issues. It kind of makes you wonder if the whole concept of species is just an illusion.
That's a thought that has crossed the minds of a lot of philosophers and biologists, even Darwin himself. Remember how we talked about him being skeptical about the line between species and varieties?
Yeah, he wasn't convinced there was a clear dividing line, was he?
Nope. He argued that there's no single process or pattern that definitively separates a species from other groups. He even went so far as to say that the term species is just a convenient label we use.
So are we just imposing order on a world that's inherently fluid and interconnected? Is the whole concept of species something we just made up?
That is a very fascinating question. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's talk about a concept called species pluralism.
Species pluralism. Isn't that the idea that there might not be one right way to define a species? That we should just embrace all these different approaches?
You got it. Instead of searching for some kind of single unifying concept, species pluralism says, hey, there might be multiple valid ways to define a species, each one highlighting different aspects of what it means to be a species.
It's like the philosophical equivalent of saying different strokes for different folks.
Exactly. We've got concepts like the biological species concept, which focuses on interbreeding, the phylogenetic species concept, which looks at shared ancestry, and so on. They each offer a different piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we're ditching the one true definition and embracing a multitude of perspectives. That's pretty inclusive, but doesn't it get a little chaotic? How do you choose which concept to use in any given situation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some species pluralists, like philosopher Mark Ershevsky, argue that we need criteria to evaluate the different concepts we use to make sure they're scientifically sound and not just arbitrary groupings.
So it's not just a total free-for-all. There are some ground rules.
Precisely. These criteria often involve looking for what are called epistemic virtues. Basically, things that make a concept scientifically valuable. Like, is it testable? Is it internally consistent?
We want our species concepts to be based on good science, not just random classifications.
Exactly. But of course, not everyone's on board with this whole pluralism thing. You've still got folks out there who are arguing for one unifying concept to rule them all, a way to make sense of the whole biological world.
It's a philosophical battle royale. Team one true concept versus team embrace the plurality.
You could definitely say that, and the debate rages on. But there's one more twist to this whole species saga that we need to consider, and that is microbiology.
Microbiology. You mean those tiny little bacteria and viruses and all that? What do they have to do with all this philosophical pondering about species?
More than you might think. Remember, the vast majority of life on Earth isn't like us big multicellular organisms. It's those microscopic critters. They're everywhere, quietly running the show.
True, they are everywhere.
And just like with bigger organisms, microbiologists also grapple with this whole species thing. How do you define a species in their world?
So are we back to square one then, trying to figure out if bacteria have essences or if they're individuals or sets?
Not quite. Microbiology has its own unique set of species concepts, ones that are specifically tailored to those tiny organisms. For example, there's the recombination species concept, which focuses on the ability of microbial genomes to recombine, to basically swap genetic material.
So like bacterial sex.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. But the point is, this concept is focused on the flow of genetic information between microbes, not just on their shared ancestry or structural similarities.
Fascinating. So even in the microscopic world, defining species gets tricky. Different rules, different concepts. It's all about adapting to those unique challenges.
Exactly. But it gets even more complex, because even if you accept this species pluralism and you embrace all these different definitions, there's still this fundamental question. What makes all these different species actually species? What's the common thread that ties them all together?
Yeah, if a species can be an interbreeding group or a lineage with a unique ecological niche or a set of organisms defined by their genetic data, what is it that unifies them all under that single umbrella of species?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's one that has puzzled some very bright minds. Some people suggest that all species, no matter how they're defined, are ultimately genealogical lineages.
So even though there are different types of lineages, some interbreeding, some not, it's that shared ancestry that makes them all species.
That's one possibility. But then you run into the problem that other taxonomic groups, like genera or families, are also genealogical lineages. So we still haven't really answered the question, what, if anything, makes the species category unique?
It's like we're going in circles. Are we chasing a phantom here? Does the category of species even exist in a meaningful way?
Well, that's a debate that continues to this day. Some philosophers, like Ereshefsky, argue that the species category is just too diverse, too vague to be a real category in nature.
Like we're trying to force a square peg into a round hole, trying to cram all these different lineages into a category that doesn't really hold up.
That's one way to look at it. But even if we doubt the existence of the species category itself, that doesn't mean that the individual lineages we call species aren't real.
Okay, I think I'm falling. So maybe the grand overarching category of species is a human construct, but the specific groups of organisms we call species, like Homo sapiens or Canis familiaris, those still have biological meaning.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction. And it leads to a very thought-provoking question. If the concept of species is so fluid and context-dependent, what does that mean for how we understand the world and our place in it?
That's a great question, and one that we should definitely delve into further in part 2 of this deep dive.
Yeah. It really does make you think twice about things we take for granted.
For sure, it's like you grow up learning about species and it all seems straightforward.
Right.
And suddenly someone's like, what if everything you thought about species is totally wrong? Like, whoa.
Definitely challenges our neat and tidy way of seeing things.
And I imagine it raises some issues too, right? Like practical issues, maybe even ethical ones, especially when it comes to things like conservation.
Absolutely. You're trying to protect endangered species, but if species aren't these fixed categories, then where do you draw the lines? Which groups get that protection?
Right. Do you go with interbreeding populations, evolutionary lineages, or maybe groups that share a certain role in the ecosystem? Tough calls.
For sure. And those decisions, they often involve a lot of different factors, not just science, but human values too.
Values, you mean like ethical stuff or even what a society thinks is important?
Exactly. So some people might argue that we should prioritize species that have a really unique role in the ecosystem, even if they don't fit neatly into our usual species categories.
So a species that's kind of fuzzy in terms of its definition could still be super important for keeping things in balance, and therefore it should be protected.
Exactly. And sometimes it's even more complicated than that. You might have to consider things like how much funding is available or how urgent the situation is.
Right.
Those things can influence which species concept we use.
So it's not just an abstract debate happening in a classroom somewhere. These philosophical questions actually affect how we understand and protect biodiversity in the real world.
Absolutely. It really underscores the need for these different groups to talk to each other. Scientists, philosophers, policymakers, and the public, too. We need everyone at the table to make smart decisions about the future of life on our planet.
This deep dive is really highlighting how much philosophy and science are intertwined.
Yeah.
They each kind of push the other forward. It's really cool.
It is a dynamic relationship for sure.
Okay, so after looking at all these different ways to define species, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they encounter this incredible diversity of life out there?
I think the most important thing to remember is that humans love to categorize and label the world around us, but nature is often much more fluid and interconnected than we give it credit for.
Like we're trying to impose order on a system that thrives on change and complexity.
Exactly. The idea of species, it's useful for communication and research, but it's ultimately something that we humans created. It's a tool we use to make sense of the amazing web of life.
And maybe, just maybe, recognizing that inherent fluidity and connection is a good thing. It reminds us that life is always evolving and doesn't always fit into our little boxes.
I totally agree. It's a source of wonder and a call to approach nature with a bit of humility and an open mind.
Well said. So on that note, we'll leave our listeners with one final question to chew on. If the concept of species is so fluid and context-dependent, what does that mean for our understanding of ourselves as humans and our connection to everything else on Earth?
That's a profound question and one that deserves a lot of thought. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into all the mysteries out there.
And don't forget to tell a friend about this deep dive. Let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, it really does make you step back and think, doesn't it?
It does. It's like we think we've got it all figured out.
Right.
And then we realize that even these basic ideas we take for granted are actually much more complicated than we first thought.
So where does all this leave us? I mean, we've talked about essentialism, the idea of species as individuals, as sets, even those challenges with defining microbial species. We talked about Darwin's doubts and all the ins and outs of species pluralism. It's been quite the deep dive. It has been a deep dive. And I think what we've really learned here is that there just isn't a simple answer to the question, what is a species? It's fluid, it depends on context, and it's shaped by both science and philosophy.
So we're left with some uncertainty.
I guess you could say that, but I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. It keeps us curious, keeps us asking questions, and helps us appreciate just how complex and interconnected the natural world really is.
It's like a reminder that the world doesn't always fit neatly into our little boxes.
Exactly. And that can be a pretty amazing realization. It lets us see the world in a new light, to see the nuances and how everything's linked together.
So what's next for our listeners? How can they take all this and apply it to their own understanding of things?
Well, I'd say stay curious. Keep learning about all the amazing life out there. And don't be afraid to question the things you think you know, even the most basic ideas.
And remember, it's always more fun to explore with friends. So talk about these ideas, debate them, and keep diving deep into the worlds of science and philosophy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you with one last thing to ponder. If the boundaries between species are more fluid than we thought, what does that mean for us as humans and how we fit into the big picture of life?
Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of species. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.